Well, I was thinking about what we would preach through in this first quarter of the year when I fell upon Paul's first letter to the Corinthian church. And not long after I'd made that decision, my father-in-law handed me an article from the Australian newspaper by Greg Sheridan entitled "Christianity's Weird Success." And so I quote Greg Sheridan here. He says, "Christianity will revive in the West in a very big way in the coming decades, for the West is entering a phase of paganism, and history shows paganism is inherently ripe for conversion. The best historical example is the debauched and raucous port city of Corinth in the time of Paul the Apostle." So I thought, thanks, Pete. That's nice timing and nice confirmation. Greg goes on to say, "St. Peter described Roman life as debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, idolatry, reckless, wild living. And Corinth put Rome in the shade." The ancient world used the name of the city as a slang term for engaging in prostitution. It was a brutal place with an enormous gulf between rich and poor, and it was a place where they held games to rival those of the Olympic Games. There was a lot of razzle-dazzle about that city as well. Greg Sheridan goes on to say, "If Christians could crack the first century Corinth, contemporary Manhattan, seedy King's Cross, swinging Soho, atheist Amsterdam, these should be a walk in the park one day." End quote. And I might add, Marutna. So it's worth even just a dip into this letter to see what we might take away for our own situation. Paul had established the church in that place of Corinth, and now he's having to write to them from all the way over the waters in Ephesus, another tough city, a place where Paul at one stage was nearly murdered for preaching Jesus. This letter that he writes covers a lot of ground. He begins and ends by unpacking the heart of our faith. In between, he'll address curly relationship issues and the right use of the Spirit's gifts. A lot of that is Paul trying to steer the Corinthian church in the right direction and away from disaster and away from their old way of life. So in the intro, he reminds them of who they are. This bunch of folks who used to live in sin, or who still live in Sin City, who used to go to worship the false gods like Artemis with their offerings of money and by going to the big temple parties, who bedded down with prostitutes on a regular basis as a way of life, who got face down in the dunnies drunk probably every day and loved to pig out at get-togethers, who were doing everything they could do to get rich or die trying. It's these very same people that God has sanctified, made holy, set apart for his special purposes in King Jesus. In the way he addresses them here, Paul continues to be blown away by the sheer extent of the grace that God has extended these folks. Their lives are like a black and white contrast. Just so God extends that grace today here in Marupna to you, and through you to this wicked city, for he has set you apart for his special purposes in King Jesus here. Who you were is no longer who you are in King Jesus. Paul then reminds them that they are not alone in Sin City. He reminds them that there are others out there, other Christians in the big wide world. In chapter 16, he will name all the individuals and congregations that care about them and remember them regularly in thought and prayer. And Paul says of himself, he is always praying for them. The congregation that thinks they are all alone in this universe becomes a club or a cult. And the Christian who thinks their faith is all about them individually will think that they are right and everyone else is wrong, or they will eventually fall away. Paul says to the Corinthian church, you were called into fellowship, even in that dangerous place, because you are not alone. You are not alone, St Albans. We're sharing this building right now, aren't we, with our friends from the Uniting Church? In fact, we can't seem to keep you guys away. What a terrible problem. We share this building with Two Rivers Community Church, and now for a time we'll be sharing it with the Salvation Army as well. There are another 2 congregations locally, and over this city of Greater Shepparton there's at least 30 Christian congregations meeting for worship. In the Anglican world, we are, with the 33 other parishes, part of the Diocese of Bendigo, which with 23 other dioceses cover this entire country, which with 865 dioceses form the Anglican Communion, on which the sun never sets and which has greater international representation than the United Nations, and is itself a part of the Church Universal, 2 billion people and counting. I was talking to someone over lunch the other day who had been a part of a tiny church in the middle of nowhere, one of the smaller denominations. And they were talking to me as though I was a part of the big bad, you know, the Anglican Church, you know, liberal weirdos, whatever they think. It's like, well, don't get too discouraged, mate. The typical human being on this planet at this stage is the Christian. We outnumber the Chinese, we outnumber the Indians put together, we outnumber everyone else on this planet. So none of us can get in a little pity party or think that we're all alone in this universe. And around the clock, St Albans, you are either on someone's mind or someone somewhere on this planet is praying for you. You are not alone and never will be. Paul then reminds the church in Corinth that they have everything they need. They have the grace of God in King Jesus, which has caused their lives to do a U-turn. They've been growing stronger and stronger in their ability to tell the story of King Jesus, a story that wicked city so desperately needs to hear so that it might be healed. Can you tell the story of King Jesus in your own words? Have you had any practice lately? Telling that story is like doing push-ups. The more you do, the stronger you become. You've got to use it or lose it. In a city like Corinth, there'd be no end of opportunities to get a sensational workout. If you're thinking, oh, Simon, I struggle to do that, well, here's a couple of clues. Go home and read Acts chapter 10, verses 34 to 43. We read it here last week. Won't find a better summary of the Christian faith. Or fast forward in 1 Corinthians to chapter 15, verses 3 to 7. A great summary of what we're on about and the story of King Jesus. Because if you can't tell the story of King Jesus, who will? How do you think the city of Corinth changed for the better if it wasn't for those daring and courageous individuals who had been saved by grace telling the story of Jesus to others? Because this city of Mooroopna ain't going to save itself. Paul tells them that they have every spiritual gift they need to do the work of King Jesus. Because the story of King Jesus isn't just accompanied by words, but with power. So they can be confident that they won't lack for manifestations of God's supernatural power, especially his love, as they work towards the end of all things. Paul will unpack some of that in chapters 12 and 14. You're starting to get the feeling like you should go home and read this whole letter yourself this afternoon. The Corinthians have the promise that they will have the strength they need to live for Jesus all the way through to the end. And you better believe that they'd need that strength to find their way to the finish line blameless before King Jesus, because they were surrounded by a city that wanted to pull them back into the black hole. King Jesus would never leave them in the lurch. So often congregations look around at their context and think it's just too hard. Well, you ain't a Christian in Corinth. So often Christians look around and add up everything they don't have and basically throw in the towel. We don't have X, Y, Z spiritual gifts in this church. We don't have the music that we think we want. We don't have the people, resources, money, a building. You name it, we lack it. Instead of looking at what they do have to hand. And you know what they would see if they looked at what they do have? Everything they need to serve King Jesus in the place he's put them to the very end. I'm grateful that this has been the attitude of this congregation, at least for the 2 decades I've known you. Paul says that they and us have all this because God is faithful. When we get the wobbles up, when we don't think we can do it, God remains faithful and will keep giving us everything we need to the very end. Because it's on him. In the end, it's not on us. God says to you today, you have been set apart by my grace. You are not alone. You have the story of my Son, King Jesus. You have the gifts of my Spirit, and you'll have my strength to the very end, because I am faithful. Amen.